The dark history of Lennox Castle Asylum does not begin with madness, restraint, or institutional silence. It begins with ambition, stone, and landscape, in an era when architecture itself was designed to declare power long before it was ever asked to contain suffering. In the early 19th century, on elevated ground overlooking the Campsie Fells north of Glasgow, Lennox Castle was constructed not as a hospital, but as a statement. Built between 1818 and 1837 for John Lennox Kincaid, a wealthy landowner whose family had accumulated influence through land consolidation rather than nobility, the castle was conceived in the Romantic Gothic Revival style that dominated Britain's elite imagination after the Napoleonic Wars. Its turrets, battlements, and symmetrical facade were not defensive in any medieval sense, but symbolic, an architectural performance of permanence, control, and lineage. The castle sat within a vast estate of carefully managed farmland and woodland, its elevation allowing uninterrupted visibility across the valley below. From its very beginnings, Lennox Castle was designed to look down upon the world around it. That visual hierarchy would later become one of the most unsettling symbolic features of its second life. For nearly a century, the castle remained a private residence, passed through ownership changes as fortunes rose and fell, its grandeur expensive to maintain in a Scotland increasingly shaped by industrialization rather than landed wealth. By the early 20th century, the estate had become a burden rather than a triumph. The First World War accelerated this decline, draining estates of labor, capital, and social relevance. By the 1920s, Lennox Castle stood largely empty, its architecture frozen in a moment of aristocratic aspiration that no longer matched Britain's social reality. Yet the building's isolation, scale, and existing infrastructure made it attractive to a new kind of authority, one that did not seek beauty or prestige, but containment. In 1927, the General Board of Control for Scotland identified the Lennox Castle estate as a potential site for a new mental institution. At the time, Scotland's existing facilities for people classified as mentally defective were severely overcrowded. This terminology, now recognized as dehumanizing and scientifically flawed, was rooted in early 20th century psychiatric theory and eugenic ideology. Individuals with learning disabilities, epilepsy, autism, brain injuries, and a wide range of social or behavioral differences were grouped together under broad administrative labels, not because of medical clarity, but because the state sought efficiency and segregation. The prevailing belief was that such individuals required lifelong institutional care, removed from society both for their own supposed protection and for the perceived moral and genetic health of the population. The transformation of Lennox Castle from private estate to state institution was not immediate, nor was it subtle. Construction began in the early 1930s not by adapting the castle itself for patients, but by erecting a massive hospital complex adjacent to it. Opened officially in 1936 as Lennox Castle Hospital, the facility was designed to house over 1,200 patients, making it one of the largest institutions of its kind in Europe. The castle, once a symbol of individual wealth, became an administrative centerpiece, while the true function of the site unfolded in regimented wards, dormitories, workshops, and service buildings spread across the estate. The architectural philosophy behind the hospital reflected contemporary ideas about order and control. The wards were long, linear, and repetitive, built to maximize visibility and minimize privacy. The patients were separated by gender and by perceived level of functioning, with children housed apart from adults but still within the same institutional logic. Windows were large but placed high, allowing light without offering a view of the surrounding countryside. Doors were heavy, Corridors extended endlessly, and movement was tightly regulated. While the hospital was publicly described as progressive and humane, its physical design communicated a different reality, one in which efficiency outweighed individuality and supervision replaced care. From its opening, Lennox Castle Hospital absorbed patients from across Western Scotland. Many arrived as children, transferred from poorhouses, orphanages, or family homes deemed unable to manage them. Admission was often permanent. Families were told, sometimes explicitly, sometimes through implication, that institutionalization was in the patient's best interest, and that return was unlikely. Records show that some parents never visited again, not necessarily out of cruelty, but because distance, poverty, stigma, and official discouragement made ongoing contact difficult. For others, visits became rituals of grief, conducted under strict rules and emotional restraint. By the late 1930s, Lennox Castle Hospital was already overcrowded. The outbreak of the Second World War intensified these pressures. Staffing shortages became chronic as nurses and orderlies left for military service or better-paid industrial work. Those who remained were expected to manage hundreds of patients with minimal resources. Under these conditions, care became custodial rather than therapeutic. Restraints were common. Sedation was routine. Education and meaningful occupation were limited to a small fraction of residents, often those deemed capable of contributing labor to the institution itself through laundry, farming, or maintenance work. The hospital's official reports continued to emphasize order, cleanliness, and efficiency, but internal correspondence and later testimonies reveal a growing gap between public narrative and lived reality. The children spent their formative years within locked wards, their development shaped by institutional routine rather than family life. Adults aged rapidly, not only from medical conditions but from inactivity, malnutrition, and emotional deprivation. The surrounding landscape, rolling hills, open sky, seasonal change, remained tantalizingly close yet entirely inaccessible, visible from windows but unreachable without permission. Architecturally, Lennox Castle itself loomed over this system as a silent witness. Its turrets and crenellations, once decorative, now watched over a population stripped of autonomy. The building's elevated position reinforced a sense of surveillance, intentional or not, as if authority itself were embedded in stone. The irony was profound. A structure built to project aristocratic independence had become a symbol of institutional confinement. As the decades progressed, Lennox Castle Hospital would become increasingly controversial, its conditions scrutinized by reformers, journalists, and eventually former staff and residents. But in its early years, criticism was muted, softened by wartime necessity and public trust in medical authority. What unfolded within its walls during this period laid the foundation for one of Scotland's most troubling institutional legacies, a history not defined by a single atrocity, but by sustained neglect, structural indifference, and a system that mistook isolation for care. This is the world into which thousands were placed, often without choice, often without exit, and rarely with a voice that reached beyond the estate's boundaries. By the time the Second World War ended, Lennox Castle Hospital had become a world unto itself, governed by routines that rarely changed and hierarchies that were seldom questioned. The institution now housed well over 1,000 residents, many of whom had entered as children and were quietly transitioning into adulthood within the same walls, unseen by the society that had placed them there. Officially, Lennox Castle was described as a hospital, yet the medical model that justified its existence offered little in the way of treatment or cure. For the majority of residents, diagnosis was a fixed label rather than a starting point for care. Once admitted, a person's future was largely predetermined by administrative classification rather than medical progress. Daily life inside the hospital followed a strict and repetitive rhythm. Residents woke early, were washed and dressed in communal dormitories, and marched in lines to dining halls where meals were served quickly and uniformly. Clothing was institutional, often ill-fitting, chosen for durability rather than dignity. Personal possessions were minimal. Privacy as a concept barely existed. Even the act of sleeping took place under constant observation, rows of beds aligned to allow staff to monitor dozens of residents at once. For children, this environment became normal, shaping their understanding of human interaction through rules, bells, and supervision rather than affection or choice. Staffing shortages remained a defining feature of Lennox Castle throughout the 1940s and 1950s. One nurse might be responsible for 60 or more residents during a single shift. Under such conditions, care inevitably became impersonal. Feeding, bathing, and discipline were performed as tasks to be completed rather than relationships to be nurtured. Physical restraint was widely accepted as a management tool, particularly for residents who were nonverbal or who displayed behaviors staff found difficult to control. While such practices were legal and common across Britain at the time, their routine use at Lennox Castle would later be recognized as deeply damaging. Medical intervention, where it existed, reflected the limitations of contemporary psychiatry. Electroconvulsive therapy was used on some residents, though records suggest it was applied inconsistently and often without clear therapeutic goals. Sedative medications were widely administered, not to treat underlying conditions, but to maintain order within overcrowded wards. These drugs dulled behavior but also suppressed personality, further reinforcing the perception that residents were passive and incapable rather than individuals reacting to confinement. Perhaps the most striking feature of Lennox Castle Hospital during this period was its reliance on patient labor. Residents who were deemed capable were assigned work throughout the estate, including farming, laundry, kitchen service, cleaning, and maintenance. This labor was unpaid and framed as occupational therapy, yet it also significantly reduced operating costs. Fields were cultivated, buildings maintained, and food produced largely through resident work. While some individuals reportedly took pride in these tasks, the absence of choice or compensation complicates any claim that this system was benign. Labor became another mechanism through which the institution sustained itself. The castle itself continued to function as an administrative and symbolic center. Staff offices occupied rooms once designed for private luxury, and meetings about budgets, admissions, and classifications took place beneath vaulted ceilings and stone arches. The contrast between the castle's decorative grandeur and the utilitarian wards below was stark. Architecture reinforced hierarchy, authority above, confinement below. It was a physical manifestation of the power imbalance that defined the hospital's culture. Public awareness of conditions inside Lennox Castle remained limited for decades. Families who did visit were often escorted and shown only selected areas. Official inspections tended to focus on sanitation and record-keeping rather than emotional well-being. Reports emphasized compliance with regulations, not the lived experiences of residents. In this environment, neglect did not require malice. It thrived through routine, silence, and institutional momentum. Yet cracks in this system slowly began to appear. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, new ideas about disability and mental health were gaining traction across Britain. Psychologists, social workers, and disability advocates began to challenge the assumption that people with learning disabilities required lifelong segregation. Small-scale community living experiments demonstrated that many individuals previously labeled ineducable could learn, work, and form relationships when given appropriate support. These developments did not immediately change life at Lennox Castle, but they planted seeds of doubt within the very framework that had sustained it. Former staff members later recalled a growing sense of unease during this period, an awareness that the institution's scale and isolation were becoming liabilities rather than solutions. Younger nurses questioned practices their predecessors had accepted without comment. Families began asking why their relatives could not return home, or why children were not receiving education comparable to that offered elsewhere. These questions rarely produced immediate answers, but they accumulated, gradually eroding the authority that had once shielded Lennox Castle from scrutiny. Behind the stone walls and orderly routines, the human cost of institutional life continued to mount. Residents aged without milestones, birthdays marked only by the passage of time rather than celebration. Deaths occurred quietly, recorded in ledgers and followed by unmarked burials in local cemeteries or hospital plots. Grief, like individuality, was absorbed into the system and rendered invisible. As Britain moved towards social reform in the post-war decades, Lennox Castle Hospital stood increasingly out of step with emerging values. Its architecture, once modern and purposeful, now appeared monolithic and outdated. Its practices, once justified by medical authority, began to look more like containment than care. The institution had not changed, but the world around it had, and that difference would soon become impossible to ignore. By the late 1960s, Lennox Castle Hospital had become a symbol of a system under strain, not because it was uniquely cruel, but because it embodied the accumulated failures of institutional care on a massive scale. Britain was changing. Social policy, medical ethics, and public expectations were shifting in ways that made places like Lennox Castle increasingly difficult to defend. The language of mental deficiency, once embedded in law and medicine, was slowly being questioned, and with that questioning came a reassessment of the environments in which thousands of people had been confined for decades. Inside the hospital, however, daily life remained largely unchanged. Residents still moved through the same corridors, slept in the same dormitories, and followed routines established long before reform entered public debate. What did change was the level of scrutiny. Government inquiries into long-stay hospitals across the United Kingdom began to expose patterns of neglect that were no longer dismissed as unfortunate necessities. While Lennox Castle was not immediately singled out, it was increasingly discussed within a national conversation about whether such institutions could ever deliver humane care, regardless of staffing levels or funding. One of the most profound criticisms concerned the lifelong confinement of children. At Lennox Castle, many residents had been admitted before the age of 10 and had never lived outside institutional walls. Education, where provided, was rudimentary and inconsistent, focused more on behavior management than intellectual development. Children grew up without family structures, without exposure to ordinary social life, and without opportunities to develop autonomy. Reformers argued that the institution itself created disability by limiting stimulation, choice, and emotional connection. This idea that environment could shape outcome directly challenged the foundational logic of Lennox Castle Hospital. The hospital's physical design, once praised for efficiency, now came under renewed criticism. Long wards amplified noise and stress. The absence of private space intensified conflict and withdrawal. The separation of residents by perceived ability reinforced rigid hierarchies that often bore little relationship to individual potential. Architecture, which had once been neutral or even progressive in intent, was increasingly understood as an active force shaping behavior and well-being. Lennox Castle's scale, its very vastness, became evidence of its failure to see residents as individuals. Staff morale reflected these tensions. Recruitment became more difficult as nursing opportunities expanded elsewhere, offering better pay and less emotionally draining work. Those who remained often described a sense of futility, an awareness that no matter how hard they worked, the institution itself limited what could be achieved. Acts of kindness existed as they always had, but they occurred within a framework that discouraged meaningful change. Innovation was rare, not because staff lacked compassion, but because the system was designed to resist deviation. Public attention intensified in the 1970s, fueled by investigative journalism and advocacy from emerging disability rights groups. Media reports across Britain began to describe long-stay hospitals as places of abandonment rather than care. Although Lennox Castle was not immediately exposed by a single scandal, it was increasingly understood as part of a broader institutional problem. Former residents and staff, when given the opportunity to speak, described lives shaped by routine, boredom, and loss of identity. Their testimonies challenged decades of official reassurance. Government policy slowly followed public sentiment. The principle of care in the community gained traction, proposing that individuals with learning disabilities should live in smaller, supportive environments integrated into society rather than isolated on remote estates. For Lennox Castle Hospital, this represented an existential threat. Its entire justification rested on centralization and segregation. Decentralization would render its scale obsolete. The process of change was slow and often chaotic. Transitioning residents out of the hospital required housing, trained support staff, and social services infrastructure that did not yet fully exist. Many residents had lived at Lennox Castle for 40 years or more. For them, the institution was not merely a place of confinement, it was the only home they had ever known. Reform, however necessary, carried its own risks. Policymakers grappled with how to dismantle a system without abandoning those it had confined. Throughout this period, Lennox Castle itself began to decay. Maintenance budgets were reduced as long-term closure became a realistic prospect. Lakes went unrepaired. Paint peeled. Once imposing corridors grew dimmer, their institutional character now matched by visible neglect. The castle, no longer central to daily operations, stood increasingly empty, its rooms echoing with absence. Architecture that had once symbolized authority now reflected uncertainty and decline. For the residents still inside, time moved differently. Announcements of reform did not immediately change daily experience. Meals were still served on schedule. Beds were still aligned in rows. Yet uncertainty permeated the atmosphere. Some residents were gradually transferred to smaller units, often with little explanation. Friendships formed over decades were abruptly severed. Others remained, watching numbers slowly dwindle, unsure whether departure meant freedom or loss. By the early 1980s, Lennox Castle Hospital was widely regarded as outdated and unsustainable. What had once been presented as a humane solution to social anxiety about disability was now seen as a relic of fear and misunderstanding. The institution had not failed because of a single decision or individual, but because it was built on assumptions that no longer held moral or scientific credibility. The question was no longer whether Lennox Castle should close, but how to end its history without repeating the mistakes that had defined its existence. The closure of Lennox Castle Hospital was not marked by a single date or decisive moment, but by a prolonged unraveling that stretched across the late 1980s and early 1990s. As residents were gradually relocated into community-based housing, the institution thinned out, its vast spaces increasingly occupied by silence rather than routine. Each transfer represented both progress and loss. For policymakers, it was the realization of reform. For long-term residents, it often meant leaving behind the only world they understood. The hospital that had once been overcrowded now felt cavernous, its remaining inhabitants dispersed across wards designed for far greater numbers. The process exposed the emotional consequences of institutionalization in ways that reports and statistics never could. Some residents struggled profoundly with transition, overwhelmed by choice, noise, and responsibility after decades of regimented living. Others adapted with surprising resilience, demonstrating capacities long dismissed by diagnostic labels. These outcomes underscored the central critique of Lennox Castle's legacy, that the institution had not simply cared for disability, but had actively shaped it through deprivation of opportunity. Staff, too, were affected by the closure. Many had devoted their working lives to the hospital and experienced a complex mixture of relief, guilt, and dislocation. The routines that had structured their days vanished alongside the wards themselves. Former nurses later spoke of conflicting emotions, recognition that the institution was flawed, coupled with lingering affection for residents they had known for decades. Closure did not offer easy moral resolution. It simply ended a system that no longer fit its time. Lennox Castle Hospital officially ceased operations in 2002, ending nearly 70 years of institutional use. By then, the site was largely abandoned, its buildings stripped of furniture and equipment, its grounds overgrown. The castle itself, vacant and unsecured, became a magnet for curiosity. Urban explorers, photographers, and local residents entered its decaying rooms, documenting peeling wallpaper, collapsed ceilings, and remnants of administrative life. These images circulated widely, transforming Lennox Castle into a symbol of haunting abandonment. Yet this popular imagery often obscured deeper truths. The real history of Lennox Castle was not contained in broken windows or crumbling stone, but in the lives that had passed through its gates. The danger of aestheticizing decay lay in shifting attention away from human experience toward visual spectacle. The castle's ruin became a backdrop against which stories were simplified, sometimes sensationalized, stripping context from suffering. In the years following closure, debates emerged about what should be done with the site. Developers proposed housing projects. Preservationists argued for protection of the castle as a significant example of Gothic revival architecture. Disability advocates emphasized the need to remember the institution's social history rather than merely its architectural value. These perspectives often conflicted, reflecting broader tensions about how societies choose to remember uncomfortable pasts. Tragedy returned to Lennox Castle in 2008 when a fire destroyed much of the main building. The blaze, believed to have been started accidentally, consumed large sections of the structure, collapsing roofs and leaving only fragments of walls standing. For some, the fire represented a final erasure, a violent end to a place already emptied of function. For others, it symbolized unresolved history, destruction without understanding. The fire accelerated decisions about the site's future. What remained of the castle was deemed unsafe and demolition followed. Where towers and battlements had once stood, there were now open spaces, foundations, and memories. The surrounding hospital buildings, long since abandoned, were also demolished, making way for new housing developments. Streets replaced wards. Gardens replaced corridors. Life returned to the land in a form unrecognizable from its institutional past. And yet, absence does not equal forgetting. For former residents, families, and staff, Lennox Castle remained a powerful reference point. Stories continued to circulate, often fragmented, shaped by memory and silence. Academic studies, oral history projects, and advocacy work sought to document these experiences, ensuring they were not lost beneath redevelopment. The focus shifted from architecture to accountability, from buildings to people. Lennox Castle's legacy forces uncomfortable questions. How did a society come to believe that segregation was care? How did medical authority justify lifelong confinement without meaningful treatment? And how easily did normality reassert itself around an institution that quietly removed thousands from public life? The answers lie not in individual blame, but in collective assumptions about difference, productivity, and worth. Today, the landscape where Lennox Castle once stood appears ordinary. Children play where wards once stood. Houses line streets that never existed during the hospital's operation. Yet beneath this normality lies layered history, a reminder that progress is not inevitable, and that good intentions, when combined with fear and ignorance, can produce systems of profound harm. The dark history of Lennox Castle Asylum is not simply a story of the past. It is a cautionary narrative about power, architecture, and the human cost of deciding who belongs in society and who does not. Long after the last building was cleared and the final administrative record archived, Lennox Castle continued to exist in a different form, no longer as a place, but as a question embedded in Scotland's social memory. What remained most difficult to confront was not the physical ruin or the institutional statistics, but the scale of invisibility the asylum had produced. Tens of thousands of life years were spent within its system, yet for much of the 20th century, those lives left almost no trace in public consciousness. The absence of headstones, personal archives, or formal memorials was not accidental. It reflected a deeper discomfort with acknowledging how ordinary, lawful, and widely accepted the system had been. Historians examining Lennox Castle in the decades after its closure began to shift focus away from sensational narratives of cruelty and toward something more unsettling: normality. Most staff were not sadists. Most administrators believed they were acting responsibly within the knowledge of their time. Most members of the public rarely thought about what occurred beyond the estate's gates. This ordinariness is what gives Lennox Castle its enduring moral weight. The institution did not rely on secrecy alone. It relied on social consent, on the quiet agreement that some lives could be set aside for the sake of order, convenience, or fear. Archival work revealed how language played a central role in sustaining this consent. Terms like defective, incapable, and burden appeared repeatedly in official correspondence, transforming people into problems to be managed rather than individuals to be supported. Once categorized, residents became administratively static. Movement into the institution was easy, movement out was rare. The bureaucracy surrounding Lennox Castle functioned like a one-way system, reinforcing the assumption that institutional life was permanent. Even when residents showed improvement, the lack of alternative housing and community services made discharge impractical, further justifying continued confinement. Architecture once again emerges as a silent participant in this process. Lennox Castle Hospital was not hidden underground or behind fortress walls. It was visible, elevated, and expansive. Its very presence normalized institutionalization by embedding it into the landscape. The building did not conceal exclusion, it monumentalized it. This visibility paradoxically reduced scrutiny as the institution appeared stable, orderly, and official. What was hidden was not the structure, but the experience within it. As disability rights movements gained strength in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Lennox Castle became a reference point in discussions about historical injustice. Activists emphasized that community care was not a benevolent gift, but a delayed correction. They argued that many residents could have lived fuller lives decades earlier if society had invested in support rather than segregation. These arguments reframed Lennox Castle not as a tragic necessity of the past, but as evidence of choices made and alternatives ignored. The absence of a formal memorial at the site remains controversial. Some former families have called for plaques or remembrance spaces acknowledging those who lived and died there. Others fear that memorialization risks reopening wounds or simplifying complex histories into symbolic gestures. This tension reflects an unresolved national question: how to remember institutions that were legal, normalized, and harmful without reducing them to either villainy or nostalgia. Academic interest in Lennox Castle has continued to grow, particularly among scholars studying institutional trauma and social policy. Comparative studies have placed it alongside similar hospitals across Britain and Europe, revealing patterns that transcend geography. Lennox Castle was not an anomaly. It was a node in a broader system shaped by industrialization, eugenics, and administrative efficiency. Understanding it requires resisting the urge to isolate blame and instead examining how modern states manage vulnerability. For former residents who survived into community living, memory remains fragmented. Some remember Lennox Castle as a place of fear and restraint. Others recall moments of companionship, routine, or safety, complicated by the absence of alternatives. These memories resist easy categorization, reminding historians that lived experience does not always align neatly with moral frameworks imposed afterward. The harm of institutionalization does not erase the humanity that persisted within it. Today, Lennox Castle's land appears ordinary, almost anonymous. There is no architectural cue to signal what once stood there, no visual interruption in the suburban rhythm. This disappearance raises its own ethical questions. When sites of confinement vanish completely, what safeguards remain to prevent repetition? Memory, in such cases, must be actively maintained rather than passively inherited. The dark history of Lennox Castle Asylum ultimately challenges the idea that progress is linear. It shows how systems built with confidence can later be recognized as deeply flawed, and how long it can take for society to acknowledge harm once it has been institutionalized. The story does not end with demolition or reform, but with responsibility. The responsibility to listen to those once silenced, to question structures that promise efficiency at the cost of dignity, and to remember that care, when stripped of humanity, becomes something else entirely. Lennox Castle no longer casts a physical shadow across the Scottish landscape, but its history continues to cast a moral one, asking not only what happened there, but how easily it was allowed to happen at all.